Welcome to Transformed and Transformational, a TeachBeyond podcast. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities.
This year, we are celebrating 70 years as an organization.
It really is such an incredible milestone, and so much has happened in that time.
Yeah, the next few weeks of episodes will continue our regular cycle of Zoom in, Teacher's Desk, Work and Calling, and Spiritual Development. But we're going to bring in a number of Teach Beyonders to help tell the story of those 70 years. To help us celebrate and introduce these episodes, we actually have David Durance, TeachBeyond's president, here with us today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. It is so sweet to be a part of these episodes as we celebrate all that God's done. I did notice, and without offense, that you did not ask me to be a guest. And I think, it's a sweet thing to take a moment and reflect back on what God has been doing through others over the many years of being Teach Beyond. And I think one of the things that makes Teach Beyond is that our leaders are still with us today. Our former leaders are here, and we're standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. And it is so sweet. It is so important to just take a moment, reflect on what God has been doing, so we can look forward to what God is going to do in Teach Beyond in the years to come.
Absolutely. And, I think many of our listeners may not be aware that Teach Beyond is actually the new name for a mission that's been around for 70 years. So we celebrate our 70th anniversary, but Teach Beyond is actually a newer name.
Yeah, I actually grew up knowing about the Janz Team Ministries, and for nearly 50 years, that was our organizational name. And we were known as the Janz Team that did music ministry, sharing the gospel in post-World War II Germany.
Yeah. And then in 2009, there was an official name change to Teach Beyond. And this reflected a new era with a focus on education, but with the same roots and mission for gospel proclamation. And this is a specific time frame we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, so for the first guests of this series, we have George and Beverley Durance, who are actually David's parents. George formerly served as Teach Beyond's president for 10 years, and Bev served faithfully in Teach Beyond donor services.
George and Bev were both born and raised in Three Hills, Alberta, and their parents worked for Prairie Bible Institute. Over the course of their marriage, Bev and George have lived in Canada, Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Bev earned her bachelor's degree in biblical studies from Prairie, and then earned a music and voice performance degree and a master's in German.
George has bachelor's and master's degrees in history and earned his PhD from Durham University in educational philosophy, looking at the philosophical context of transformational education. He served as a teacher and then school director at Black Forest Academy in Germany for 12 years. And then when they moved back to Canada, he became president of Ambrose University, but remained connected by serving on the Janz Team board.
It was 12 years later that George became president of Janz Team, during which time he led the transition from Janz Team to becoming Teach Beyond.
Needless to say, George and Bev have both had a profound influence on who Teach Beyond is today.
I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say.
Let's go over to that conversation now. Welcome to the podcast, Bev and George.
Great. Nice to be with you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Yeah, thank you.
So, Bev and George, we're so excited to talk with you today about this topic because Teach Beyond hasn't always been Teach Beyond. So we want to rewind back a number of years ago to when Teach Beyond was Janz Team. So, Bev, we're going to start with you. You're from the Janz family who began Janz Team Ministries. So what does this mean to you personally? What was it like to grow up in the Janz family? What memories do you have? We'd love to hear about that, kind of taking us all the way back to the beginning.
All right. Well, thank you so much for asking this question, Heather, because it's been an interesting journey for me. And I've had all 70 years of my life to think about it because Janz Team and I share a birth year, 1954. And my memories are pretty clear because the development of the Janz Team had a pretty significant impact on me personally. It was in a very simple way. When I was 5 years old, I realized that my relatives were going to do something very special. It was very confusing for me, but that was good. But it also meant that it was taking some of the people that I loved most and I saw every day, and they were going to a faraway place called Germany, and I had no idea what that was. And that founding team, which was made up of a singing quartet, was made up of three brothers and a brother-in-law. And the three brothers, Leo, Hilder, and Adolf Janz, were my dad's brothers. And the fourth member of the quartet, Corny Ends, was married to my mother's sister, Kay Rimple. So very close family relationships. And this tied our family very closely to the work of the Janz team. And my knowledge grew of the work throughout the years. And when the brothers and their families came to visit, we heard many reports about huge crusades and people coming to Christ. And although I didn't understand that really perfectly, I knew I could be proud of their work. And then when I was in elementary school, my father decided to rent our pretty nice home in Calgary, Alberta, and move to a not so nice home where the Janz team office was. And I remember there were some pretty heated discussions with my mother and father about this, because this was a real sacrifice. But my father wanted to help the team in this way. Well, my mother got on board, and before long, she was opening the mail and handwriting every receipt for the donations that came in for the work. And these are huge memories for me as my childhood. Our house literally was the home office for the whole organization. So crazy.
Yeah.
And that meant that everyone who came, like on furlough, as we called it in those days, home assignment now, they came and they visited us. And I absolutely loved those visits. They were amazing. And I heard these amazing stories about how God was at work in Germany, and then later other countries, especially Brazil. So that was great. But it was not until I moved to Germany to serve at Black Forest Academy that I fully understood the incredible impact that the Janz team had on the spiritual landscape of Germany. Hardly a week went by in those 12 years when someone found out I was from a Janz and immediately started telling me, oh, my father, my sister, and my brother accepted Christ at a crusade or a camp of Janz team, and our families were forever changed. It was so impactful for me because the people I'd heard about all my life now had a face, and I just couldn't get enough of it. So the answer to your question, Heather, is yes, being part of the Janz family played a huge positive role in my life.
I'm sure that's so hard to wrap your mind around what it looks like on the ground when you're all the way in Canada, being able to go there and actually live there.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were surrounded by missionaries and the idea of serving overseas from birth your entire life.
Yeah.
And so when you and George got married, did you guys already think about planning on serving overseas, serving with the Janz team? How did that end up coming about?
Well, George is going to answer this question because the story is his. But I wanted to mention, too, that George's family was also very close to one of the founding families. And in fact, my parents knew that something was afoot with George and me when he stopped calling them Uncle Edwin and Aunt Mary. That said, we had no idea when we got married that God would lead us to serve with the Janz team. But that story to the call to service really is all George's.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Bev. I loved our heritage together there back at Prairie, but we really didn't know each other because Bev's folks moved off to Calgary, and then because my mother and father were Canadian and American, we spent time down in the U.S., down in California, and then moved to different places. So our paths didn't cross again until a little bit later after Bible college, where we saw each other because we ended up both going back to Prairie Bible Institute. But as to the actual call, that happened about 10 years after we were married. So we were married in 75, and it was getting into 1985, maybe 84, 85, somewhere in there, that our pastor, Wendell Grout at First Alliance in Calgary, was doing a series on Nehemiah. And it was a wonderful series, but our pastors give us wonderful series all the time. It was just that it so happened that we were in a moment to listen. And he asked the question, if you were being like Nehemiah, you should be saying to yourself, Lord, what is it that you put on my heart to do for you? because you don't want to get to your rocking chair years and say, well, I wonder if only I had. And so we got in the car and we're driving home. And I'm not so sure that this sermon had really impacted Bev the same way it had impacted me.
Definitely not.
But at least she knew what I was talking about when
Yeah,
I
totally.
turned to her she was in the front seat, of course, with me, and I was driving. And I said, "Well, sweetheart, uh, in, what's been on your heart to do for the Lord?" And she said, after sort of a reflective moment, "I think maybe being a missionary." And I saw that as a kind of firm commitment on her part. And I think she thought of it as, yeah, the
Not so
weather is
much.
kind of warm and sunny today or something. Like it was just a throwaway comment. Whereas for me, it was, I guess that's what I've thought about too. And there's a good reason then, if you think about it, both being raised in a mission oriented Bible college where we would have this deeply implanted in our consciousness. And over the years, really moved by what God had done, not only in Bev's family with the Janz team, but many other missionaries' biographies, and things like from the 19th century, but even 20th century missionaries that we had met personally, like Don Richardson, Arthur Mao, uh, Elizabeth Elliot. So we had seen and interacted with these people, having them either in our home or speaking to us from platform. And so our hearts were tuned into what God was doing globally. And for me personally, I was also an educator. So to be tuned in was to think, well, how could I use education? And we'll see how that all plays out later, I think, as we talk more about what God did. But just initially, no, we definitely weren't thinking about missions when we were married. It was about 10 years later and a couple children later that we said, wow, we would really like to do something for God, and we don't want to get old and wonder what it would have been like to do that.
George, I'm not sure that there's ever going to be rocking chair days for you. I can't see you doing that. But
Oh, thank you,
wow,
Heather.
it's so encouraging and inspiring to hear how God has had brought you to that point, and that it was just so familiar to you, Bev, that, oh, missions would be an option. That isn't
Yeah.
everyone's story, but for you it was. And then to follow through in time and say, okay, what does this look like for us to do something? That's really encouraging.
We're going to be skipping ahead a lot, George, but I know you went overseas to serve at Black Forest Academy with the Janz team. And then a while later, the Janz team became Teach Beyond, and you were a big part of that. So it feels like a big deal to lead an organization through a rebranding, such as from Janz team to Teach Beyond. How did you know that it was time for there to be such a big change?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a great question. Um, yes, it's true that it is a big thing to transition like that, and you can imagine that the issues are complex. There's not a simple way of knowing. It wasn't God just revealing it in a dream or something. There were lots of very practical things that were going on, not the least of which was that I had been involved over maybe a decade in changing the name of an organization, let's see, at least twice. And it was a big organization, so we had a ton of work to do, a lot of background work and lots of meetings with committees and hiring consultants and all kinds of things. So when we thought about changing the name at Janz Team to Teach Beyond, yes, it was a kind of a crisis because Janz was my wife's maiden name. Uh, and it was also a crisis in the sense that it represented deep and profound changes that were taking place in the organization. It wasn't just a brand. But in another way, for me, it wasn't uh, an issue. I wasn't worrying about it because I had already had experience in doing that with other organizations, and it seemed like a natural thing to do. Why do you change your name? That's such a key thing, and especially God's blessed this name, and it's so well known in Germany. Well, that's part of the problem. It wasn't well known anywhere else. It had faded from people's consciousness in Western Canada, which was sort of the heartland of the organization. So I would say that the state of our organization, Janz Team, was a key part in knowing that it was the right time, because it had become, can I say, it had plateaued, maybe even started to fade, which is the normal thing that happens in organizations after 40, 50 years. There's a kind of cycle that you go through. And the idea of having crusade evangelism was becoming increasingly a 20th century idea, and we were looking at a different reality. I think that the uh, the biggest motivator in all of this was just strictly a deep desire to say the same thing in the 21st century that our forefathers had said in the 20th century. And if we're going to do that, we had to change how we said it. So the first thing you do is change your brand, so it's clear to people how it is you're going to introduce Christ to people. We're going to do it on a platform of education rather than on a crusade platform in an altar call. And God just really impressed on us. It wasn't me, it was a whole group of us who were planning and thinking about this. Uh, he impressed on us that the most effective way to help people grasp this new way of proclaiming Christ was going to be to change the name. And sure enough, I remember Mark Weeb was one of our leaders in communication, telling us later that when we changed the name from Janz Team to TeachBeyond, that we had a tenfold increase in traffic to our website. So, that just right away clicked with us, that that had been the right name at the right time, and God was going to bless us. We had no idea really what that meant, though.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's certainly, now I'm in the mobilization team and we're talking with people and recruiting, and it certainly is a neat way to be able to just quickly say a little bit of what we do. It's right there in our name that education is at the heart of things. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, I love thinking about change management, the field of, effectively bringing about change. And it takes intentionality to do that well. So, George, I'm wondering, what was it that you did intentionally, or that team did, to effectively facilitate a smooth transition?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, Heather, that we didn't sit down and draft a paper. Okay, here's the strategy.
Yeah.
I'll tell you though, we started by praying, and I
Mm.
think this has become a real hallmark of Teach Beyond, is that we pray and we pray and we pray before we do things and while we're doing it. And we really started. I say this sincerely. We started praying and just asking God how we could do this, because we recognized that for many people in a dispersed community, this was going to be really weird, really strange. And so God has to prepare the way. And we knew that. And then when we prayed, we did it in faith. And when you have faith, you always act. Faith is never sitting on your backside. So you ask and then you act. And we acted by going to all the different corners of the Janz Team world. There weren't very many, but there were a few: Brazil, Switzerland, France, and out into Eastern Europe, and so on. And we talked to the people and we listened. We said that this is what we were thinking of doing. Would they please pray too? And we built a consensus across the organization. I think it probably took about a year to do that. And everywhere we went, the remnants of the Janz team that were still there that we could bring together, they were 100% supportive and enthusiastic about the change. So I think making it a prayer item, about listening, about asking for feedback, about being patient with people while they came to understand what it was about, making it a team decision. All of these things. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to say. We also, once we started, we didn't let go. I mean, we just hung in there. I've said before in other contexts that when you put your foot on the accelerator, don't take it off, because you'll never find it again. Well, we had already cleared all the technical things about, domains and so on. So we knew we could do it legally. And then we just said, okay, we're all in, we're going. And we didn't quit. It just kept going, and God prepared the way. We didn't beat people over the head or somehow make it a, a litmus test of their loyalty to the organization. He just went ahead, and people were open and receptive and understood right away what it is we were trying to do.
I love it. I love that you started with prayer, and that's so important. And it's a wonderful place to start. And it is true that does carry through the organization today. And as you talk, you went around and you had to talk to people about shifting the focus to education. But it's one thing to then kind of shift the focus. Hey, we're going to do education, but casting a vision for the future is another kind of hurdle to overcome. How did you do that and get people to kind of embrace that as a vision of what could be long term?
All right. Well, Bev certainly was a very important voice in helping us communicate this. Well, when you say cast a vision, Kian, there are really two words there, and we put them as one and make it a kind of construct. But if we just separate them out a little bit, um, the first thing is, if you're going to cast a vision, you have to actually have a vision. And most people, I think, when they think of vision, they're thinking more of a mission or a kind of strategy. A vision, you can tell if you're casting a vision by saying something like this: when we do all that God has asked us to do, what we see is, so it's the seeing part. Vision is actually seeing something, and we see transformed lives. We see people changed across the globe based on an educational initiative that the Holy Spirit has empowered and used. So you have to start with something that is is seeable and people can understand that. And then in terms of casting it, I think there are two sides to the same coin. You do need someone to lead that casting, that explaining, that constant repetition of what it is we're talking about. And that person needs to step up and be bold and trust God even when you don't feel it. It's very hard to be the leader in casting a vision because you're way out there on your own. And your voice sounds very funny to yourself. You feel like you're in an empty room, and then you listen for others starting to say it. And I'll tell you, it is astonishing when casting a vision becomes more than a one person event. I mean, that you after a little while of casting a vision as a lone person, and you hear all this happening, you just sit back and you just marvel at what God is doing, because there's so many people more articulate than you stepping up and casting it. And, oh, yes, that's great. Please keep saying it over there. Somebody else, oh my goodness, I love the way you're saying. That's far better than I could say it. So that's part of casting a vision. Is it's like throwing a little pebble in. Somebody has to throw a pebble in, but then you just watch the ripples go out, and it's amazing. So starting with something you actually can see, that people can believe, they understand, it's clear, it relates to what they're doing, and then wait to see God bring a whole team of people saying it, and then you're casting something.
I've thought about, or I've heard it said that vision casting is like, I'm going to go first. And hear you saying that, George, that it takes someone to go first, but you recognize that others will follow and then will have new expressions of the vision that you casted, and how rewarding. And I know you're such a humble leader to say, okay, I'm just going to throw that pebble and get out of the way. And I want those ripples to go farther than I ever could take it. And that's such a good perspective for us all to have, to know that we're throwing a little pebble in when we see something happening. When we catch the vision, we can throw some new pebbles, and we hope that it goes much further than we ever could have imagined, right? So what did this big change, the change to become Teach Beyond, make possible for the organization in your perspective?
Well, maybe Bev can help me with this. I think one of them is a much better connection to churches. we had pathways into churches that we'd never had before. You know, a lot of people have asked us how we did all this, and I've quite rightly said, well, we don't know, because it's so clear God did it. And what we thought was that we'd grow this little organization maybe from 100, 150 to maybe 200. And we all knew that everyone in the organization was involved in this way of introducing people to Christ. And I just found that as I worked with other mission societies, that a lot of them had a beautiful mission, which was whatever your mission is, or whatever you feel God wants you to do, please come with us. We'll help you get abroad, and you can do these things God's put on your heart. And I think that's beautiful, and God's used that in a most effective way. But it's not us. It's not Teach Beyond. Uh, if you want to work with Teach Beyond, you need to be embracing this educational dimension. And that's why we today have such a unity across thousands of people in many countries, because we know that we're all doing this one thing about bringing people to Christ and discipling them. It's education.
Yeah, I think too, George, it brought clarity to those that wanted to partner with us, because they knew, I mean, right away, they were interested in education, and they knew what they were asking. I ran the info email box for a time, and every day, I mean, people around the world wanted the kind of education we were providing, and it was clear what we were doing. And so the idea of partnerships across the world was made possible by this change.
And just one more thing to add to that, Bev. It allowed us to go everywhere. See, a lot of organizations can only work in a niche market, but there isn't a barrier to us socially, economically, politically. Everybody wants education for their people. There are all kinds of barriers, but you know what? Education in various formats penetrates all of those niches in society.
Let's take a short break for special 70th anniversary story.
My name is Brittany Mann, and I serve with Teach Beyond Church Relations. But my journey with this organization has deep roots, ones I didn't fully understand until a few years ago. I spent 5 years serving at Black Forest Academy in Germany, but it was a visit to my grandmother in Alberta, Canada, that revealed something incredible. While going through some of her old boxes, I stumbled upon a record. As I looked closer, I saw the name Janz Team. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that Teach Beyond had once been called Janz Team, but I had no idea my grandmother had ties to it from way back when. When I showed it to her, she began sharing stories and photos from decades ago, stories of how Janz Team had visited her community. And then it hit me. Before I was even born, my family was familiar with the very organization that would eventually become Teach Beyond, the organization I now have had the privilege to serve with for over 10 years. It's a powerful reminder of how God weaves his story through generations. I'm so grateful to be a part of an organization with such rich historical roots, one that continues to impact lives and share the gospel today. It's proof that the seeds we plant today can echo through history in ways we may never fully understand. So wherever you are in your journey, remember that you're a part of something bigger than yourself. Your story matters, and God's work is always unfolding.
Let's go back to our conversation now. Most of us probably don't know what Janz Team looked like in 2008 compared to 2009 when it then became Teach Beyond. Can you kind of describe that situation that was happening that then encouraged you? Because you changed the name from Janz Team to Teach Beyond. You didn't just say like, okay, let's shutter Janz Team and start a new organization. Kind of what was the feeling? How did that all take place?
Between 2008 and 2009 was in one way very small, in another way very large. Very small, we didn't change any of the values. We did our best to retain what was being used by God in such an amazing way. But what did change was an important sort of organizational structure. So Janz Team in 2008 was comprised of 9 what were called branches, and this had grown out of the Canadian homeland and the German base, because all the ministry in the early years was in Germany and then in the immediate surrounding countries, so France and especially Switzerland, um, and then later into Portugal. So there was some work in Western Europe, and actually towards the end of this time, there was some work in the United Kingdom and also in an Eastern European country. And then the German-speaking people had migrated to South America and various other countries. And so there was an invitation in Latin America to have us come there and do some work. So this would have been like in the 1970s, 80s, and so on. But by the time 2008 had come along, the so-called branches that formed this tree called Janz Team Ministries had largely become autonomous. And there was a collegial feeling amongst them. Everybody enjoyed and loved each other, but there were no pathways of interconnection. People weren't working in partnership at all with each other, and some things were working, some things weren't working. And overall, we had really, truly plateaued financially. There was some difficulty. And when we came in, we said we wanted to set aside the whole idea of branches and we would become one global entity. I don't want to go into a technical administrative description of what took place, but we changed it from a branch concept to a unitary concept, and we all work together and are mutually dependent on each other and responsible to each other. So that was organizationally the change that took place. And that combined with a new vision of what God could do through education galvanized the whole thing. That's what God used. We did these things, but still it was like the dry bones where God breathed life into it. So even though we created these new structures and wrote all kinds of manuals and policies and everything, they were just dry bones. And God just breathed into them. And shockingly, they stood up and they were a great host.
Bev, after having
Yeah.
served overseas for a number of years, you stepped into a role with donor services. Could you talk to us a little
That's
bit
right.
about your experience with that?
Well, that's a very sweet story because who would have guessed that I would follow in my mother's footsteps and process the donations to support this work, and this is how it came about. Uh, immediately after George became president, we moved to the Chicago area to set up the U.S. office. There was no U.S. office. We were kind of being serviced by another organization. And there was no awareness of TeachBeyond or even Janz Team in the U.S. at that time. And so that was in 2009. And the bottom line, at that point, I had left the work that I was doing in Calgary. We left that. And at that time, Jack Stenicus, who was running the business operations of the organization at that time, said, we really need someone to open the mail and scan the mail to Canada, where the U.S. donations were being processed at that time. So once again, the office was in our home. We didn't have a place to put the office. But as the organization grew rapidly, it was obvious very shortly the Canadian office said, no, we can't do this work. It's growing too fast. We can't process all these donations. So with about a day's notice and an hour on the phone training, we took over donation processing in our home. And within a month of that, we decided, oh my word, we can't do it in our home. We need other people to help. This is growing fast. And it was such a tumultuous time. And I studied what we were doing in donor services. I began to have ideas about how could, in this new world of education, as the organization was changing, how could we change what we were doing from donor entry to a department that would actually partner very closely with the growing number of missionaries. You have to know that so many more missionaries are being recruited. And a little phrase popped into my mind one day and it stuck. And that was, no gift goes ungiven. And that seems like the super simple thing to say, but it was not simple. It was tumultuous, but we forged ahead. And as we did that, God provided wonderful people who were just sold out to our motto and the mission and vision of the organization. And we developed all sorts of things to meet the growing need. This was a very important part of the organizational development. We decided we wanted to answer the phone at least 40 hours a week in the US. And we changed our phone system so we could answer the phone anywhere in the world. And we also determined that we would take every opportunity to develop relationships with the donors. And our listeners need to know that, to understand that TeachBeyond was almost totally unknown in the US. And, it was a new name also in Canada. The donors knew their missionaries that they wanted to support, but who was TeachBeyond? They just didn't know. And some people even stopped their payments because they said, who's TeachBeyond? You're frauding us, So our job was to give the organization a face for the many people who wanted to support the work. There was no other way to do it. And we thought that would transform our donors. And it did, but it also transformed us. The donors became our friends and our partners in ministry. They knew us by name and they welcomed our help. And it was just a great time, and I think a key part of the growth of the organization. And in my work with donor services, transformation came from seeing big and small miracles every day. And one of my favorite things was talking to donors and listening to their stories of how God had moved them to give. And for some reason, they love to do that. And I love to hear them. And Heather, your grandmother was one of those people, as you know. I loved my conversations with her again and again. I saw God at work, and I was often moved to tears. And what a joy then to write the missionary or the project leader and let them know that God had answered their prayers and was sending a provision that would more than meet their need. I just love seeing God's hand of provision at work every day, and that transforms a person.
Those personal stories are so powerful. George, I'm sure being a part of such a big transition, I assume there might have been times of doubt of, did we make the right decision to move to this new Teach Beyond mission? And I'm wondering if you can tell a story about a time when you saw fruit from the ministry in a way that maybe surprised you or reassured you that it was the right move, that becoming Teach Beyond was the right decision.
Okay, now that's a good thing to think about. It's true. It was hard. It was very hard, and Bev could affirm this, but there was hardly a day that went by where I didn't. I just wondered if I could keep going. So how does one keep going? How does one persevere in doing good? As we know, we will reap a harvest if we keep persevering. And one of the ways is to remember right from the beginning that God has gone before and prepared hearts, and that you're in the center of His will, no matter how hard or discouraged you feel. I remember when I was getting ready to transition from the university that I was working at to the work at TeachBeyond, coming back to TeachBeyond, I guess you would say. And I had a group of students, university or seminary students, actually. There was a university with a seminary. And these young men came in to talk to me, and they said, "Oh, we hear you're going to work in a mission that's going to be working with education, and you're going to all these different countries and so on. Please don't forget our country." They were from Southeast Asia, and they'd been studying at the university for a while. "Please don't forget our country." I said, "Okay, well, you write to me when I'm in my new role, and I'll follow up if you help me." And so a few months after we'd moved down to Chicago to take up the work there, I got a letter from these guys, and they said, "Okay, remember you promised." And I thought that they would forget. I actually hadn't forgotten myself. And so I said, okay, well, you give me a contact, because I didn't know anyone in that part of the world. And they gave me a contact who had a contact. You know how these stories work. And we ended up in this country on a Asian tour and went to meet this person. And he was an important businessman. And he said, well, 10 years ago, I came to know the Lord in a most dramatic way. And it was because of some very unusual circumstances. And I decided that I was going to offer an educational platform for our people to come to know Christ. And I have prayed for 10 years. And I decided this last month that I needed to not just keep asking God, but to start doing something. So I organized, starting this last month, and appointed a person to lead up the education. And now I know why, because here you are ready to partner with me. And that's exactly what I need. That whole country became kind of a light bulb for us. It came on and we thought, oh, this is how this works. It has just snowballed, but it was God working it all out ahead of time. So, when you're going through the hard times, if you have these memories of God calling and affirming this and saying, see, it's all ready for you. Just keep going. It I've got it sorted out. Don't worry. And he did that over and over and over again during those years. It was amazing.
That's so good to have that reminder. And, thinking back, hearing these stories, looking back, remembering helps us to move forward. It helps us keep in mind what we need to know moving forward. And so I'm wondering, for either of you, what do you hope Teach Beyond doesn't forget about its Janz Team roots? What should we be taking forward with us as we continue as Teach Beyond? And what also, on the other hand, maybe what excites you about where Teach Beyond is going today?
There's so many things that were part of the Janz Team character that are they are part of Teach Beyond, and we see it. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned today was that, well, we mentioned it at the very beginning, that it was a singing organization, and that has continued. And we hope that that expression of praise and worship is not lost. And the country that George was talking about, we went and visited there. There was a whole large group of leaders there, and we went there, and I had kind of organized the people into a choir. So we sang this incredible song, 4-part harmony. I gave the parts out, and the people in the country just were dumbfounded that an organization would be able to just throw the people up there and sing this beautiful song of praise. And so that, I think, that was the characteristic of the team all along, and it's so great that continues.
Well, I totally agree. I had that in my mind too. I hope we never give up singing, as we know God dwells in the praises of his people. And when we sing together and when we pray together, we sense his presence. We know he's there. And of course, he uses it in wonderful ways. I would say the joy that they had, and maybe it's part of being a family. This family loved each other and they loved laughing. I just hope we never lose that as an organization. That just joy and enthusiasm and the family quality. I think we're a little bit different than a lot of organizations because we do have, very good structure and policies and all this kind of thing, but we're also very willing to flex and to adapt and things that only families can do. And maybe the last thing I would say is that these were people of faith. And they really, really sacrificed when they set off to who knows where. Just the willingness to put uh, everything on the altar, sacrifice it for the proclamation of the gospel, and to do it with joy and thanksgiving. And, they were also what I would call gentlemen and gentlewomen. Such graciousness and kindness to each other. and respect and so on. And this is what we want, even when we're disagreeing and have hard things and so on, to just remember that we're brothers and sisters. We love each other. That's the way they did it, and that's how they kept going in the hard times.
I love that. There is so much to take from the history. And so much of it is based on the family, based on
Yeah.
their family connections, their love for each other, their love for God, and then their willingness to serve.
Hmm.
Those are such good reminders. Yeah.
I think the founders had they had this incredible concern for people who were lost without Christ, without hearing the gospel story and responding in faith. And night after night for many years, they preached the gospel in these large arenas, and people responded in the thousands. But then, and then they didn't leave them without follow up. They had discipleship too, short-term Bible schools. They connected people with churches. And I believe Teach Beyond is carrying that same ministry out. And just in this day, in today's world, our missionaries are doing this, communicating the gospel and discipling students in educational settings around the world. And I think my uncles would be so pleased to see the work they started continuing in this way.
Wow, what a great way to end this conversation. I know there's so much more we could say, but um Bev and George, I just so appreciate how both of you have transitioned out of leadership roles in a way that you've ended those well. And in many senses, we see that that is a hard thing to do. And I see that both of you are, humble leaders who are not afraid to say, and keep going, keep running, keep carrying this torch forward. And um, it's great to tie that back to the founding Janz brothers and what they might say today too, to recognize that we are all part of this bigger picture of what God is doing, and it's so beyond any one of us. So thanks so much for sharing with us these stories and personal memories and experiences that are part of the DNA of Janz Team and Teach Beyond.
Thank you so much for joining us. There's one last question we ask all of our guests before we let them go. And that is, what's one thing that's changing your life this week, changing your life this month? You can kind of take it wherever you want to go, something really big and dramatic, or something small that is making a difference in your life. So I'll go first. You have a little bit of time to think about it. But the thing that's changing my life this past week, a few months, has been some scheduled calls with my brother. It takes a long time between calls and connecting, but he insisted that we have like a on the time schedule that we do it. Sometimes we miss it, but it keeps it a regular thing. And he does it because he loves to talk to my kids, and he feels like if he doesn't, they'll keep growing. So he's right about that, and it's been a big change. So
Oh,
it's been
that's
great.
great. That is so great. Well, for me, it was recently visiting a woman who was a mentor to me when I lived overseas, and getting a chance to spend time with her husband and her. And, they are now empty nesters. When I knew them, they had 4 kids at home, and we're certainly, both in different seasons now. But to visit someone that knows you really well, that you've shared life with during such a pivotal season, it was just such a gift to reconnect and to have that time together. So that was changing my life recently. What about you? Who's gonna go first here?
I'll go first.
Great.
I Well, I've experienced nothing but change since
Mm,
June 30th. After I retired, everything changed, and I think George would say, the work filled my life completely. And
mhm.
so, and there've been so many, and people were worried about, what are you going to do, Bev? What are you going to do? Are you going to collapse or what? And these are been so many good changes, and God has just filled my life with meaningful things. And I think one of the best changes has been that to have more time with my dear family, our 3 children, their wonderful spouses, and 11 grandchildren. And God has been so good throughout this change and this transition, and it's been so good, and it's been so wonderful to have more space for my family.
That's great. What about you, George?
Well, I just had a birthday. As you get older, there are a lot more aches and pains, and but we won't talk about that. The thing that has impressed me in just a wonderful way is that God all through life has used the previous experiences to prepare you for the next step. And now I come into a new time, and lo and behold, some of the lessons that I've learned over the years, people are willing to sit down and listen to. And I'm kind of shocked that they're listening, maybe even today. But it would also be that there are just many, many opportunities to keep on serving. And in fact, it's overwhelming. I think Bev has kind of given you a
Totally.
bit of a hint of that in her own life. She's just so busy doing good things and teaching. She has about 20 students, I think, something
Yeah,
like
20
that.
students. Yeah.
And for me, it's Sunday school lessons. It's helping people get some books done, and just a whole series of things. It's just, wow, Father, I don't know if I can keep up to what you got in mind. I thought this was the sort of kick back time in life,
I
but
said there's no rocking chair days, George, you know?
there's no rocking chair, not yet anyway.
Oh man, but don't we love that about both of you, how you're using these
Yeah.
years
Thank you,
still
Heather.
to serve the Lord.
Thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you for walking us through the rich, rich history of Janz Team and Teach Beyond. Thank you for your time.
That was such a great first conversation for this 70th anniversary series.
And next week, we'll be talking to 3 different educators from 3 different parts of the world and from 3 different eras of Teach Beyond and hearing from them about resilience in education.
In the meantime, we want to invite you to join us for Teach Beyond's annual Day of Giving.
If you're listening around the time that this episode releases, the Day of Giving is this Thursday, November 14th.
You can follow along on social media, where we're already posting videos with amazing stories of how God is at work.
You can also visit teachbeyond.org/dayofgiving to learn more, or click on the link in the show notes.
As we celebrate the 70th anniversary of Teach Beyond, we're reminded of God's faithfulness over the years and the role that Teach Beyond plays in education as missions.
As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all He intends.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org. To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen, so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.